There's a great emphasis put on the way that Eumaeus divides his pigs into their pens. There's a care and a rightness about the way he handles these tasks that show he hasn't fallen off in that regard, even though he hasn't had anybody overseeing him since Odysseus left. It's that connection of doing good work with virtue, with real virtue, and something that makes him admirable in terms of his piety, his loyalty, all those things. Homer is just powerfully underscoring that with the way he presents Eumaeus to us.
I'm Peter Tardif, and I'm here with Dr. Glenn Arbery on Build What Lasts, a podcast of Catholic culture, skilled labor, and the intellectual life. Dr. Glenn is a novelist, a poet, a scholar, and a teacher, former president at Wyoming Catholic College. Since I started this podcast, I'd been thinking about great literature about the dignity of labor and about craftsmanship, and Homer's Odyssey has been one of the works that stands out to me the most in that category. So I wanted to talk to Dr. Glenn because I know he has a lot of wisdom and experience on Homer. Maybe just to start out with a question, Dr. Glenn, you mentioned the Cave of the Cyclops and also the early scene when Odysseus creates a raft on Calypso's island. And so I wanted to ask, given that Odysseus is a representative of excellence in Homer's world, why is it so important to Homer that he also be a carpenter and a craftsman?
I think it indicates a level of character in Odysseus that we might not expect. I mean, we tend to think of the moral virtues as something other than the kinds of things that go into good craftsmanship, but there are many analogies, about taking care with the circumstances of the particular that you find. And I'm always struck, I have to admit, by the raft building on Calypso's island. I mean, Odysseus has been there for 7 years, but apparently he hasn't had the tools or the kind of clearance to go ahead and do something to escape from the island. But when he does set about it, it's just kind of remarkable. I'm going to read a little bit, if you don't mind. This is from the Lattimore translation. Calypso gives him an axe and an adze, and Odysseus starts felling the trees and then trim them with his bronze axe and plane them expertly and trude them straight to a chalk line, and then he bores the holes in them and pins them together with dowels and lashes everything together with cords. So it's a very knowing way to approach building a raft, and he's already this is much later in the poem, but earlier in the sequence of it, he's criticized the Cyclops, for not knowing how to build ships and such things. So I don't know. It seems to me a kind of know-how that Odysseus has that he can then enact with his own tools, that corresponds very closely to what we think of as virtue. I know they're not the same. You can't talk about virtue and know-how is exactly the same, but the correspondence that Homer's making seems to point in that direction.
I see. Is that partially because the Cyclops, he seems to be the example of everything a Greek should not be,
Right.
also happens to be, like you said, a bad carpenter?
Right. Well, he doesn't even have any notion of carpentry, it turns out. He's good at making cheese, This is a point that Christopher Nolan's Odyssey also picks up. But and he can divide his sheep, and things like that. But otherwise, there's not much there's not much cognizance of how you do things, and that's very important to Odysseus. And you'd mentioned the Cyclops cave. Well, it's a scene that it makes you recollect that raft building, because Odysseus finds that piece of wood in the cave, and they sharpen it and get ready to blind the Cyclops with it. But again, the scene where the blinding takes place is like using an auger, or it's very crafted as as an act of blinding a giant one-eyed monster. It's pretty it's pretty reliant on the skill of the carpenter even there.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I haven't read what you wrote for the comic Train, I think, about that scene, about how Odysseus has the ability to see the resemblances of things, to see a piece of wood and seeing it the possibilities of a stake. And that's contrasted with the Cyclops having only one eye and one he can't see past the surfaces.
Right.
But I'm struck by the kind of connection between the care of things and virtue, and the phrase you use, the circumstances of the particular. You think there's something in that to be virtuous requires a kind of understanding of particular circumstances that parallels what the carpenter needs, a kind of presence to the particulars around him.
Yeah, exactly. Richard Wilbur has a wonderful poem called Junk. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's about sort of the way that axe handles, or the things you might use as tools, are made when you don't pay any attention to the particular grain of the wood or any of those things, and how they just break easily and so on. The wood is always particular, and a good carpenter is going to pay attention to what's in front of him. And I think the emphasis that Aristotle puts on the virtue of phronesis is always about dealing with the particular circumstance. So, in other words, you don't go into a situation requiring some kind of moral judgment, already having hard and fast rules, though you have a kind of habit of trying to see the good in each situation. But you have to respond to what's right for that circumstance. And that seems to me very similar to what a good workman does, and in being patient with his materials and understanding how to proceed.
Yeah, that side of Odysseus, it seemed like, was not captured in the Christopher Nolan movie. I was looking out for it in the cave when they made that stake, and it looked like they just hacked a piece of wood.
There was not a lot of art in that, right? In that blinding, I didn't find. And similarly, Peter, when Odysseus makes the raft in the Christopher Nolan movie, he seems to kind of pull together some of the wreckage of his ship, which is a little unlikely 7 years later. But also, there's none of the craft of raft making that you see in the Odyssey. It's very different experience of Odysseus on the raft that you get in the movie than you get with the poem. In the Nolan movie, Odysseus on the raft is put in terms of his surrender to the sea. Calypso, who is a kind of therapist, tells him that he's got to stop fighting against the gods and everything and surrender himself to the sea. And there's a kind of Christian overlay there, almost as though Odysseus is being crucified, in the sea, and in his surrender to what is intended for him, he finally gets home. When he wakes up, he's back at Ithaca. that omits everything about that Homer stresses, which is building the raft and staying awake for all those nights and swimming for 2 or 3 days, and finally accepting the veil from Ino, that helps him stay afloat. But it's just a very different emphasis.
Yeah. Then moving to another different emphasis. The second half of the Odyssey is so preoccupied with the signs by which Odysseus is recognized,
Right.
and how those signs are clearly indicative of his identity, right, and his connection to Ithaca, to his home. And some of those are through his laborers, through Eumaeus, who I think we have to talk about for sure today.
Right.
But then also through what he's built, through what he's helped to grow. Laertes gave him these trees when he was younger, and
Right.
and of course the only recognition scene that maybe they got right was Argos.
And he prepared that one well in advance. We see puppy Argos early in the movie.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But the Eurycleia scene wasn't altogether off, right? I mean, Eurycleia recognizes his scar. But yeah, that's much of what we know of the earlier Odysseus is just omitted from the film. Yeah. I mean, it has its own purposes. I'm not trying to run down the film per se, but it's not Homer's Odyssey. It's sort of Nolan's Odyssey,
So going back to Homer's Odyssey, to build on the previous question about Odysseus as a carpenter, why do you think it's so important to Homer that he built his house and his bed?
It's some of the same skills, isn't it? And the same understanding of how to make something as building the raft, which seems important, thematically in the poem. The bed becomes analogous to the raft in terms of of homecoming and what home is. But making the bed so stable, so rooted in the earth, and everything, and the olive tree sacred to Athena as the basis of the bed itself. It's emphasizing again Odysseus' understanding of how to do things and how meaning is made out of this deliberateness with materials and with time, with nature and the growth of the tree and the art that turns it into this emblem of human fidelity and stability. I mean, all those things are just seem crucial to the Odysseus that Homer gives us,
Yes, through his skill and knowledge of materials, he creates something that's meaningful, that begins to carry meaning, like the meaning of the fidelity of marriage or something like that.
Right. The bed itself, rooted in the earth, is such an image of immovable devotion and all those things. I mean, the way that Penelope tests Odysseus, is by saying that, somebody should move the bed out into the hallway or something. And of course, that just infuriates him. And again, you wonder, why does Christopher Nolan not pick up that great symbol, Yeah. There's no reference to the bed or to any of the imagery that surrounds it.
Yeah, I wondered if he was almost de-emphasizing the comic ending for the sake of the tragic circumstances. It seemed like that was what drew him to the Odyssey more than the homecoming at the end, right, which it would take to be the core of the Odyssey, right? Instead, he's thinking about the tragic backdrop of it, which in some ways I thought he captured really well, including Agamemnon's story, including this idea of the loss of life and loss of time, right? But when Odysseus finally comes back, those elements of homecoming are de-emphasized for the sake of bringing back the tragedy, right? This feeling that Odysseus has made an irreversible mistake with catastrophic consequences, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there doesn't seem in the film to be any redemption from that other than sort of not having a homecoming, heading west in some sort of redemptive effort that I don't quite understand, I admit. I'm not
Yeah.
sure how that westward movement is supposed to make up for what he's done wrong. Odysseus has, in a very real way, betrayed piety. You know, he's played on the credulity and the goodwill of the Trojans with the Trojan horse. And I think the film shows all that very well. But the homecoming of the Odyssey is sort of it's almost biblical in the sense that everything of that previous Odysseus has to be stripped away, tested, remade. He has to lose all his men. He has to, wash up naked on Scheria and depend on others to get home and so on. And Nolan, downplays what you're rightly calling, I think, the comic dimensions of the ending of the Odyssey.
This is off our topic of carpentry and labor, but I was really curious to know what you think of the role of Athena. She's definitely not Homer's Athena, of course, but she almost became like a Christian. To me, she seemed like a Christian god for reasons I'm not entirely sure I could say. And that seemed like the sacking of Troy and the beheading of her statue, which was such a powerful image in the film, was almost like a crucifixion.
Yeah.
And he has that scene with her. It might be reading too much into it, but with her being held right with her arms out, almost like in the posture of a crucifixion. And it does seem like impiety is some terrible fault, or almost like an irreversible sin, right? And nothing is the same after it's been committed.
Yeah. Well, the counter to that, I suppose, is the little token that Odysseus carried. We're talking about the film now, right? The token that Odysseus carries, that Penelope gives him early on, and that he's able to return with. And there's that, I feel like I didn't get enough of the dialogue in the film to understand it properly. But when he's talking to Penelope through the screen, he's also almost holding hands with the Athena figure, and there's some kind of reconciliation that seems to be going on there. And that is a deliverance or a forgiveness on her part, something like that. But that's interesting. She's a Athena in the film is a kind of strange presence, She's the one who introduces him back to Ithaca, for example. And you get those later scenes that I wish I had a little better in mind exactly where they fall and what they might mean.
Going back to Homer's Odyssey, the farming culture or the laborer culture, and especially the way that seems to focus on Eumaeus in the second half, and how he is such an interesting character because he is a slave. Like you mentioned, he's bought by Laertes, but had been kind of made into a member of the family. And of course, he's known for his loyalty to Odysseus, and I don't know, would it be fair to say he's somehow become part of Ithaca through his connection to the land and to the family?
Yeah. And he takes such good care of his swine, I mean, being a swineherd doesn't sound like the most noble occupation. And and there's so many connections, of course, to Odysseus' men as swine, particularly in Nolan's Circe scene. But there's great emphasis put on the way that Eumaeus divides his pigs into their pens, and and how he selects the ones that he's sending into the suitors and all those things. But there's a care and a rightness about the way he handles these tasks that show he hasn't fallen off in that regard, even though he hasn't had anybody overseeing him since Odysseus left. And that's again, it's that connection of doing good work with virtue, with real virtue, and something that makes him admirable in terms of his piety, his loyalty, all those things. It just seems like Homer is just powerfully underscoring that with the way he presents Eumaeus to us.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I hadn't thought so much about the specifics of the labor. Those parts of the book are easy to kind of skim over when you're reading.
Yeah, right. He has his watchdogs, and he's doing his job, and he's doing it in a way that's admirable. It'd be hard to find fault with the way he does what he does.
The dogs are quite interesting too, because they themselves seem to have a kind of virtue, like a kind of ability to recognize friends and enemies.
Right. Yeah, Plato picks up on that, doesn't he? In the Republic, when a good guard dog barks at people he doesn't know, instead of just licking his hand after a minute. But yeah, so the guard dogs bark at Odysseus when he shows up because they don't know him, but they recognize Telemachus a little bit later, you remember, and so they do rush up to him and lick his hand and so on. But yeah, dogs are important. The way that Eumaeus treats his fellow servants, the way he treats his guest. He welcomes this beggar that he doesn't know into his home. So in terms of what Nolan's movie keeps emphasizing as Zeus's law, of hospitality and of this kind of graciousness, Eumaeus is a wonderful example of that.
What do you think of the difference between Ithaca and Phaeacia? Because I thought, well, yeah, it really is hard to get out of the shadow of the movie for now, at least.
Right, I know.
That was a pretty notable omission.
Omission.
And part of the reason he seems to have taken a lot of the grace out of Homer's world, or a lot of the kind of abundance and joy that comes from dwelling with a good relationship to the gods that you get on Phaeacia.
Yeah.
And Odysseus marvels at their farming culture and how everything is laid out cleanly in rows, and that seems to be partially emblematic of the order of their lives, right, and the structure of it, right, and the rationality that they also have with law. But Ithaca is different. It's rocky soil. I know, like Telemachus tells Menelaus he won't accept the gift of horses because Ithaca is not good for horses. And of course Phaeacia is one of those islands that's almost presented to Odysseus as an alternative to coming home. Right, he could marry Nausicaa instead of Penelope and live there. So, what do you make of the difference between those two places?
I don't know if you know George Dimmock's essay called The Name of Odysseus, but that, to me, it's sort of a classic commentary on difficulty, and the fact that Odysseus' name is associated with painfulness and such. And that's how he ends up criticizing Phaeacia. That is, nothing is difficult there. Rowing is not difficult when they get on their ships. Everything seems to grow almost without Adam's curse, you could say. There doesn't seem to be the effort that's usually required for things to come into being for us. Um, and it's almost as though they're too close to the gods. Dimmock points out that when you get to the scene when is it Euryalus, the young man who challenges Odysseus and mocks him at the games that they have, uh, that they think they're better than they are because they've never really been up against any kind of challenge. So Odysseus throws the discus, for example, way beyond anybody else, and it's because he's had the life of difficulty and struggle.
I see.
So I don't know exactly how you might talk about the relation between Ithaca and there, except that Ithaca feels real, in terms of the challenges that Odysseus is going to have to surmount. And I don't, what does it mean that Phaeacia almost gets buried under a mountain, because of their
Yeah.
friendship with Odysseus? Good question, and I wish I had more to say about the exact parallels. They do have a good marriage there, right? Alcinous and Arete that's a wonderful marriage, which seems
Yeah.
like another model, but is it better than the marriage of Odysseus and Penelope? I don't know. So, yeah.
So is there on Ithaca a kind of connection of the gods to labor than like on Phaeacia? I remember Odysseus, and I don't know how much of a figure of speech this is, but I remember Odysseus as a stranger telling Eumaeus, by grace of Hermes, I can chop wood and do all this other things, right? So is there, I don't know, a kind of notion that excellence in labor comes from friendship with the gods?
I have never thought that out. Hermes, where does he say that? That'd be interesting to see. When you proposed this topic, I remembered this scene when Odysseus is arguing with Eurymachus, one of the major suitors, and sort of challenges him to a working contest.
Yeah.
Let's go out and I'll have a sickle and you'll have a sickle and we'll see who can cut the most grain at a day, and things like that. But yeah, working hard and doing things well, or plowing. Let's have a plowing contest. Let's see who can do the best furrow. Eurymachus, of course, has no notion of doing this kind of contest with Odysseus. But yeah, I'd love to see the connection with Hermes. I had forgotten that.
That contest with Eurymachus struck me because I had just read Plato's Alcibiades with the students, where Socrates tells Alcibiades that the philosopher is above working.
You never get that with Odysseus, do you? You never sense that Odysseus thinks that because he's king or because he's the leader that he's somehow above work. He's the one who's the best at work, and that always seems to be the uppermost concern, as though you couldn't really say, he's the best leader unless he's also, capable of the best work, the best labor.
Yeah.
So.
You had mentioned, we might have covered this already, but you'd mentioned the Greek word techne with relationship to Odysseus. Can you say more about that? Why it's important?
Well, techne, obviously the root of our understanding of technology, but for the Greeks it's art. It's both art and in the way that we think of art, but also know-how in terms of the skill of making things, of knowing how to do things, seems so much associated with techne. Um, but uh, and I think it's important to maybe tease it away from our understanding of technology. You know, like we're substituting technology for the that kind of virtue of work that we were talking about earlier. Um, I don't know. I haven't read Jacques Maritain recently, but in his book on art and scholasticism, he talks about art, you know, in some of the same ways that we're getting at here with techne. Building the raft is techne, you know, doing it so well, um, making a house that has the kinds of foundations that will last, you know, is the kind of techne that I think you associate with Odysseus.
It is striking to me the way Homer, you know, if I have it right, what he gives you as instructions that if you follow them, you could make a decent raft, right? Partially striking because it's not usually what an author is getting at or what a poet is getting at. Like, they're not trying to give you an instruction manual, but maybe some things that have been separated in current literature, separation of virtue and what goes into making a good raft, like those are not separated as much.
Not at all. The parallel I think of is Moby Dick. You know, sometimes when you're reading Moby Dick, you're pretty sure you know how to behave in a whaleboat. You know, and you get the whole process of stripping the blubber from a whale, and you know the whole deal. In some of the same ways that you get this kind of emphasis on labor and good making in Homer. But yeah, Homer, I mean, with the raft, you start with the right kind of wood. You know, it's been dead for a while, these trees, you know, so that they float more easily. And, you know, and then the whole deal, you know, what to look for in materials, how to cut it up, you know, how to put it together. Yeah, you feel like you could follow those instructions. And that's important.
It reminds me of Richard Weaver's definition of rhetoric, that he says rhetoric is the care of words and things, and that because of the correspondence that's supposed to be there between words and things, that someone who cares about words should care about both.
Yes,
it seems like Homer and Melville exemplify that pretty well.
Right. And Odysseus' capacity to tell stories, you know, seems analogous to his capacity to make things otherwise. He knows, you know, he knows how to put the story together, even if he's telling a lie. You know, it's a good one. It's a plausible. You know, he knows what's believable and what's not. Yeah.
Which it brings me to a question, you know, I've heard people talk about with the Odyssey, that if we know Odysseus is a great inventor and his whole wanderings are narrated by him, you know, are we supposed to take that as true? And I've always had a strong feeling that we should, and part of that has to do with I thought that Homer is not someone like William Faulkner trying to give us individual perspective, right? Like, he's trying to give us the objective account of things. And maybe in some ways Homer's I don't know, like objectification or his belief in a single account makes him more adapted to the care of things, you know, if it really is about reality and not about interpretation.
Now, if I understand you right, you mean is the fantastic tale that Odysseus tells to the Phaeacians the truth?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
All this about huge one-eyed monsters that ate his men, and, you know, witches that turn your men into pigs. That I think Homer presents us in the poem. He presents those stories as the truth. That right? That's what he's doing. There's even an underscoring of that because when Telemachus goes into the assembly back in Book 2, one of the first men that's mentioned had a son who was the last man eaten by the Cyclops. So, the framing story that Homer's giving us with Telemachus and so on has a little place in there where the Cyclops is given, a thumbs up as being, this is a true story, But yeah, anyway, I think your larger point, these are sort of the archetypal true stories. They're the ones that we kind of look to give us our bearings in all kinds of circumstances. So instead of trying to translate the whole episode with Circe into something that really happened, it becomes a kind of mythical but true account of what goes on in any number of other circumstances in real life. I'm interested to know what you thought of Circe in the film. But by the way, we had some students over the other night to talk about the film next to the poem, and one of the first things that came up was that there's sort of no eros in Nolan's Odyssey. In other words, there's no erotic bond that's there with Odysseus and Calypso in particular, or with Circe and Odysseus, and this is underscored pretty strongly in the poem. These are sort of possible alternatives to his return to Penelope. Same thing with Nausicaa that you mentioned, right? That she's even omitted from the film. So I don't know. The episode with Circe was particularly striking to me. She sort of wrestles those guys into being pigs.
I thought Calypso seemed like a character coming out of Memento or Inception, kind of like a character who's trying to feed, the man she loves a lie to get him to be what she wants him to be. I also thought it was striking that she and Circe weren't portrayed as immortals, or it wasn't really clear.
That's right. That's true.
Because to the point of Eros, I wouldn't be as inclined to say that in the book, Odysseus' Eros for Penelope is stronger than his Eros for Calypso. I'd be more inclined to say it's his desire for homecoming is stronger than his Eros, if that would be right.
In that strict regard, so to speak. Yeah, and in the poem, Circe seems to really preoccupy him. These men have to remind him that they need to go home with her. No hint of that in the film,
Yeah.
So anyway, as you say, the two women here are presented sort of as middle-aged women. Obviously Charlize Theron is goddess-like in her beauty, but still, there's no hint that she's actually immortal. Maybe one. I mean, she says something about you could stay here with me forever, something like that. But
which does undercut that great point that Odysseus choosing mortality.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier Laertes' orchard. His gifts to Odysseus, and one of the ways that's one of the signs of recognition toward the end of the poem. I was interested in your interest in that. What are you thinking about those gifts that Laertes gave Odysseus?
Something I've tried to do with that part of the Odyssey is to track through those signs and see the ways, each time Odysseus is reunited with an important family member, it's through some sign that is important to his identity and is somehow indicative of the way he belongs on Ithaca, right? That, he needs Ithaca and Ithaca needs him. And the trees of Laertes, if I remember right, it's how he convinces Laertes that he really is Odysseus, that he knows these trees, and Laertes gave them to Odysseus when he was young, and Odysseus is in some way responsible for them.
Yeah. When I was rereading it this morning, I was struck by that because, Odysseus shows him the scar. See, here's the scar, and
Yeah.
and that doesn't draw the reaction that it does with Eurycleia, but the trees do. Yeah, as soon as it goes through all those things, the pear trees, the apple trees, the fig trees, the vines, then Laertes' knees weaken and he recognizes this as his sign. But, it's sort of like the bed, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is how I know my son, because he remembers specifically these things and how he used to work with them and how they bore fruit. They were grapes at every stage on the vines and so on. It's like knowing Odysseus is knowing his care for those things that were given to him to use his skill on,
Yeah.
So Penelope knows him by his care for that bed, and Laertes by his care for these trees and these vines.
Yeah.
That's how you really know Odysseus, in other words,
Yeah. Because it shows not just that he's factually Odysseus, but it shows that he is the same Odysseus
Right.
from 20 years ago. Which
Yeah,
is so
yeah. The one who, that by the nature of what he cares about most. Yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Okay. All right.
Thanks for talking. Yeah, it was a great conversation.
Oh, well, I enjoyed it very much, of course.